Hello, everyone. I'm Ramya. I'm a product designer leading an accessibility team within Meta. Today, I'll be talking to you about steps that you can take to go from 0 to 1 in accessibility within your organization. I want to first introduce myself. I'm Ramya Ramaswamy. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a mom to a 3-year-old charming boy. My son Raghav on this slide, I'm reading a book to him. My son was diagnosed with a rare genetic condition when he was 1 year old. Raghav has mobility, hearing, and vision impairments. Once I got through the denial phase that follows the diagnosis, I decided to embrace it. I changed stairs to ramps, ditched doorknobs, removed bathroom barriers, and made our home accessible. Next, I was excited about using the internet to teach him everything under the sky. And then the reality dawned on me. The internet is not under my control. The internet, which is an ocean of knowledge to most people, is not an accessible and safe space for my son. He cannot use a mouse, read websites with poor contrast, or be exposed to fancy loading animations that will immediately trigger a seizure in him. So this realization transformed the way I think about building products. As a product designer at Meta, I've been working on making digital products accessible for my son and for everyone else. And I started this by building an accessibility team within my organization. My talk today is suitable for all audiences, but more so for people who are new to accessibility. My talk is geared towards people who want to contribute to building an accessible culture within their organization. So drawing from my personal experience of navigating technology for my son and working on accessibility within Meta, my talk today will focus on practical steps that you can take to build an accessible culture within your organization. My goal today is to empower you to take the first step to kickstart accessibility for your organization. So let's start with defining what accessibility is. Accessibility is the work you do to ensure that products are robust and usable by people with disabilities. No one ever says no to accessibility. Everyone acknowledges its importance, but oftentimes it's hard to get it prioritized. It's because even though advocacy is crucial and impactful, it's just not sufficient to bring about a change. It needs action. So my talk today is to inspire you and give you some tools to combine advocacy and combine advocacy with action. For the rest of this talk, I'll be walking you through 5 practical steps that you can follow to kickstart accessibility within your organization. Whether you're just starting to think about accessibility or have already made a dent, these steps will help you accelerate your journey. So we'll start with talking about disability culture. Then move on to talk about presenting accessibility in the context of your products and users. Talk about few strategies to identify accessibility champions and integrate accessibility into your process. And finally, we'll wrap up with some ways to influence leadership to invest in accessibility. The first step towards building an accessible culture is to understand and embrace disability culture. Learning to accept, celebrate, and recognize varying perspectives is the first step towards building an accessible culture. Start by asking the right questions. Who are people with disabilities? How do they want to be understood, and what are their needs? Developing a solid understanding on these topics will help you win those first few conversations to kickstart accessibility for your organization. Let's start with disability inclusive language. Words matter, and how you talk about people with disabilities factors into the bigger picture of your effectiveness in bringing about an accessible culture within your organization. Understanding how to refer to disability communities and people with disabilities is crucial to communicate your vision and bring along your team on that vision. But keep in mind that culture, perceptions, and societies evolve with time, and so will this language. There isn't a one-size-fits-all model for describing people with disabilities, but person-first language and identity-first language are the most commonly used approaches. So let's talk about person-first language. Person-first language emphasizes the person rather than focusing on their disability. So examples of person-first language is to say a person with autism, an individual who's deaf, and a person who's blind. So it really focuses on the person instead of focusing on their disability. The other approach is using an identity-first language. Identity-first language is rooted in an idea that all people have physical, sensory, or intellectual limitations, and they only become disabilities when the society fails to take it into account and include them. Examples of this will be to say an autistic person, a deaf person, or a blind person. So what is the right approach? It really depends. Some groups prefer person-first language, while others prefer identity-first, and few have no preference. So when you can determine a preference and you're not sure, I recommend using the person-first language because it's widely accepted in most disability communities. Next, I want to call out some examples of ableistic language. For people who don't know what ableism is, it's defined as a systematic exclusion and oppression of people with disability, often expressed and reinforced through language. Words or phrases that refer to disability as a bad thing are considered ableistic language. For example, let's take the case where someone walks out of a movie theater with a bad experience, and they could say, "This movie is lame." While this was a casual comment, it equates disability to something negative. You could instead say, "This is a bad movie." Another example is saying, "This is retarded." You should instead say something like, "This doesn't make sense." These might seem like little things, but it's very important to be aware of the words you use and how it might affect others. It's okay to use words like see, view, hear, listen, and all those words imply action, not insult. So you can and certainly use them. So understanding how to refer to the disability community is just one aspect of understanding disability culture. And there's so much more that you can learn to really embrace and internalize it. So now that we've discussed one aspect of the disability culture, let's talk about how to be intentional in including people with disabilities in your work. It's important to internalize and model it in your workplace so you can bring people along on your vision. First, model inclusive language in every conversation. People tend to pay attention to words that you use and try to use the same words. When people around you feel confident discussing disability, it opens up an inviting channel to make them your ally. Next, model it in your work and include it in your process. Write inclusive user stories. Bring in people with disabilities to weigh in on decisions while building products. When you're pitching accessibility for your product, always include ideas, impressions, and direct quotes from people with disabilities. And we'll talk about this more later in the presentation. Lastly, while it's important to paint a realistic picture of what disability entails, you should be careful to not dramatize it. The second step I want to talk about is presenting accessibility in the context of your products and users. Teams hardly say no to building accessible products, but it's very hard to get it prioritized on the roadmap. And that's because I've oftentimes seen teams struggle to see the tangible impact it will have on its users. Let's go through some ideas to present accessibility in the context of your product and users, which will help you get accessibility on the roadmap. So the first strategy is to present accessibility in the context of your users. And I've always found success working with a researcher here to get quotes from people with disabilities on how they use and interact with the product. For example, in this slide, I show an example of a person who's visually impaired and then using a voice search as the primary way to shop for products in a website. Getting quotes from those customers in the context of your product and your key workflows is a powerful way to make a case for an accessibility feature. Next, take this idea a step further and think about this feature for your entire user base. Let's take the same example, right? Voice search may not be enabling people who are only visually impaired, but also others. And here's a way to think about it. A person who is blind at birth has a permanent disability. Permanent disabilities do not change with the environment. They remain the same. And this person might rely on voice search and screen readers to interact with the website. Now, let's think about a person who has cataract. This person will have difficulty seeing and interacting with a screen reader for a short duration of time, let's say 6 to 8 weeks. And they may rely on voice search during this time. Lastly, think about a person who's driving. This person may or may not have a disability, but they will rely on voice search to complete an activity while on the go. And this is an example of a situational disability. So thinking about an accessibility feature in the context of your entire user base will help quantify the number of people an accessibility feature will benefit. With this, you can make a solid case to have the feature on your team's roadmap. In addition to positioning accessibility in the context of users, which we just spoke about, you should also position it in the context of business critical workflows. Let's take an example where add to cart button in a shopping website is not accessible via keyboard. This will block people using assistive technologies from completing a purchase on their website. This is lost revenue for the business. So highlighting the impact to the business in terms of revenue numbers or lost opportunity is also an important dimension to prioritize accessibility. After you do the groundwork to understand disability culture and position accessibility in the context of your products and users, the third step you want to take is to assemble accessibility champions. Demonstrating accessibility impact when you don't have a dedicated team can be very challenging. However, there are some ways to put together a team of motivated, committed, and skilled individuals who can support each other to make progress on accessibility. So now we'll talk through some ideas on how you can do that. Before we get into some strategies, I want to talk about and dispel a myth here and right now. It's a common idea that only a specialist can contribute to an accessibility project. That's certainly not true. It takes a village. It takes a village to launch an accessible product. No matter what your level of experience and passion is, no single person can do the job well. So keep this in mind while getting together an accessibility team for your organization. So in order to start on the right foot, you will need to get the right folks in the room. Most accessibility efforts that I've seen start by unlocking grassroots efforts. It's usually someone within the team who is passionate and who wants to advocate for accessibility, who ends up leading the whole team. So I want to share an example, more of a framework on how this could look like. Keep in mind that it could be different for your organization. The idea here is just a loose framework that you should then adapt for your organization. So first, call for self-nomination from team members. Identify champions within your organization across different disciplines. Take design, engineering, content, data scientists, product managers. Identify people from all these disciplines. Then train those people on accessibility basics. Not everyone knows about accessibility. It's a field that fairly still needs scale and awareness to get started. So train those people on accessibility basics and role-specific trainings to ensure everyone has a common starting point. Once you have a group of people identified and trained on the basics, organize a kickoff meeting. Create a shared vision. A group of passionate people, when they come together, can certainly contribute to a shared vision and a roadmap. So work with a team to come up with work streams. Some examples could be, you could have a work stream for advocacy, users, let's say design system, training. So make sure whatever is appropriate given the maturity of your organization. And while you're putting this team together, it will not hurt to have buy-in from a senior colleague in your organization to bring more structure and accountability to your team. Lastly, report and measure the team that your team has been doing in a consistent manner so it gets leadership attention. A scrappy task force, one that is fueled by passion, will give a great start to accessibility. But keep in mind that this model may need to be adapted for your organization. While the right way to do it may differ from every organization, the key idea that I want you to take away is that you need to find ways to come up with strategies to enable like-minded people to come together to work on accessibility. The fourth step to kickstart accessibility is to find a path to integrate it from the beginning in the product development process. Unfortunately, oftentimes accessibility is an afterthought. Fixing accessibility after a product is shipped can be laborious and difficult to incorporate. So the best way to do it is to really incorporate accessibility early on in the process so it becomes second nature over time and can lead to an increased return on investment in product quality, reach, and your overall user experience. Now, I'm going to walk you through each step in the product development process and talk through some tangible ways for you to incorporate accessibility into your process. Preparing for accessibility early on in the product development process can save time and resources and improve overall usability. Accessibility should be considered at the very start of the process, right in the planning stage, not after the product is shipped. So it should be accounted for when defining project roadmaps, writing briefs, and coming up with user stories, really at the start of the product development process. So integrating accessibility in the planning stage gives you a game plan, kind of a blueprint to consider it throughout the product development lifecycle. Next comes the design phase. Work with your user researcher to plan for an inclusive user research. I can't emphasize this enough. It's really important for you to listen to and learn from disabled users while thinking about a new feature. Evaluate color contrast ratios, tab targets, accessibility labels, focus areas, keyboard navigation, and even whether or not your content is accessible to people during the design phase. And this is the phase where you really bake in accessibility before it goes into development and before it is shipped. Next comes the development phase. Partner with your engineers to make sure accessibility specs are implemented during the coding phase. Take the lead, be the person to identify code issues and partner with your engineers or your designers to build an accessible product. Just like how you would do to ensure your decisions are carried along to implementation. This isn't any different than your usual process, but just being intentional about accessibility will go a long way. Next comes the validate phase. Tag team with your QA engineer or an external accessibility vendor in the validate phase to test and validate your flows. This is the stage where you find accessibility bugs to address. And I've seen teams tackle it different ways. You maintain a spreadsheet with accessibility bugs, or you work with your engineer right away to tackle low-hanging fixes, or you have a task system where you tackle and maintain it. Regardless of the approach that you take, this is the phase where you identify and maintain the list of accessibility barriers that you want to address. Next is the ship phase, which is often the most stressful time when people are not thinking about anything else. They just want to get the product out of the door. While it's not always possible to get a last minute check before shipping, it's important. It's an important step for you to review the implementation just prior to shipping. And in this stage, it almost always reveals an accessibility issue that was missed. While you might think that this is too late to fix the issue, it will help you identify and prioritize what you need to do right after shipping. So don't miss this stage. The last and the final stage in the product development process is the maintain and iterate phase. Accessibility requires ongoing maintenance, and teams should iterate and improve on it continuously to ensure any regressions are addressed as the product matures. Even the accessibility features that you incorporate might change over time as your product evolves and your UI changes. So make sure to maintain accessibility on an ongoing basis. Over time, once accessibility is incorporated as a part of the process, it becomes second nature to intentionally consider it while building every new feature or maintaining an existing product. That leads me to the last and final step to kickstart accessibility in your organization, and that's to bring leadership on board. While having a bottoms-up approach to push boundaries and accessibility is a great start, having leadership support is important to make a lasting and significant impact. And I've always seen that leadership is likely willing and ready to support your accessibility vision once you're able to demonstrate value using some of the steps that we just spoke about. Leadership responds and increases support for teams that demonstrate impact. And this can be a little tricky for accessibility. Incorporating accessibility into the product development process takes time, but it is a long-term plan that you work on. But you can demonstrate some value by tackling low-hanging fruits in the short term. One of the ideas that has always worked well for me is to conduct a cross-team bug bash. Bring together a group of people, a group of engineers or designers from different teams to demonstrate how quickly you can fix low-hanging accessibility issues. And this could be adding alt text to images, adding labels to form elements, or increasing color contrast. These are low-hanging fruits, which goes a long way in demonstrating what an accessibility fix can do. I've also found success in organizing brown bag sessions with accessibility experts. You can bring in accessibility experts to highlight design practices that can be leveraged to build accessible products. For example, creating logical content sections within a page is not only good design practice, but is also crucial for good screen reader experience. So taking some of those design practices, which when done intentionally creates an accessible experience, is a great way to map and tell folks that building accessible products is just being more intentional about good design practices. Lastly, partner with a cross-functional team member. Oftentimes, when you're leading an accessibility vision, you're called to talk upon technical aspects that might be outside of your wheelhouse. So really make an engineer, a UX researcher, a designer, or a data scientist, making your ally, have them behind the scenes to help you with some technical aspects that you might not have the background on. While leadership will support when they see demonstrated efforts, it will also help to prepare a case to emphasize the importance from a business perspective. Make a business case by focusing on product decisions, such as mobile-first approach that will improve overall customer experience and loyalty while focusing on an accessible-first development. Another strategy is to substantiate dollar savings. I'm not a huge fan of this one because it might not always be possible. But there are ways to do this by sharing case studies of companies that have avoided huge expenses that come from lawsuits to address accessibility-related complaints. And as I said, even if this is not possible, just sharing other case studies is going to tell you what you would prevent by building accessible products. Lastly, find ways to organize activities that nurture an inclusive mindset. Come up with ways to create an open space to discuss accessibility. This could be workplace groups, Slack channels, or whatever tool your organization uses. But seeing people be active there and talking about accessibility is going to inspire leadership to adopt accessibility more formally into your team's culture. And that brings me to the last section of my presentation today. I hope you're able to use the 5 steps that I talked through to move your accessibility journey forward. I want you to remember that building a culture of accessibility within your team takes more than just advocacy. It requires influencing people, shattering misconceptions, embracing technology, and adopting an inclusive mindset in everything that you do. So before I wrap up, I want to encourage and invite you to become an accessibility champion for your team. Take the first step. Take the first step today to embrace accessibility and influence other people in your team as well. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my presentation. I'd love to connect with you on LinkedIn, on accessibility topics, or on any other interesting topics that you want to discuss. And if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them now. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ramya, for the great presentation. And hopefully folks will be able to apply some of the techniques that you shared with us to help kickstart accessibility within their own teams and organizations. All right, so I do have a bunch of questions, and let me get started. And for folks that, feel free for the next 10 minutes, we're going to be going through questions. So if you do have any questions, please include them in the Q&A section of the chat. All right, so the first question I have here is how you mentioned, identifying a champion as one of the important steps. So how do you identify your accessibility champion? What do you look for a good candidate to be a successful champion and a great advocate for accessibility?
Sure, that's a wonderful question. Just based on my experience at Meta and prior companies, what I've seen is accessibility champions are mostly the most passionate advocates of accessibility. They're the ones who are willing to learn about accessibility and do what it takes to get it on the radar of the organization. So really the qualities that I look for is to see how passionate they are and how willing are they to learn about accessibility. Accessibility is a very technical space, and you can choose to stay at an advocacy level, which is great. I'm not saying you need to get technical, but if you want to get technical, there's a lot of learning that needs to be done. So really being open to it, being open to evolving technologies is what I look for in a champion.
Okay, great, perfect. Thank you very much. All right, next question I have is, do you have any tools, tips, or resources for finding persons who are differently able to test?
I would say that this is something that varies with organization. So within Meta, we have a user research team that works to identify people with disabilities, and we have a panel and we engage with them on an ongoing basis. So it really comes down to your organization, who your customers are, and how you want to engage with them. And I think just engaging, I'm not sure if there are specific usability panels that we can tap into, because I don't think that will have a good representation of people with disabilities and a diverse set of pools. So I really recommend working with your user researchers to see how you can expand your panel from what you already have, if it doesn't have disability representation in it.
Right, excellent. Thank you so much. All right, so I have a question here. Okay, so it says, I would like to kickstart accessibility in my organization, but they're struggling with funding. So do you have any tips or suggestions on how they can secure funding and kickstart accessibility?
Yeah, I think I want to go back to some of the content that I had in my slide. So I think when people struggle to secure funding, I have always seen it's because they haven't seen the value in it yet, because money comes when people see the value in it. So some of the recommendations that I have is to really start tackling those low-hanging fruits. Identify accessibility issues that you are able to resolve on your own or with your team of champions and demonstrate the value for it. I think that will be crucial to securing funding. And that's been my top go-to strategy. And if you were to think more tactically about, say, funding accessibility audits, right, which usually is the bulk of the money. Let's say you want to hire someone to come in and audit your product, that could be pretty expensive. Some of the ways to go around that is to really learn about accessibility and try to audit it on your own. But I see that as a more technical aspect, which will take time and a lot more resources. Chances are that if you're struggling with funding, you don't have the resources to do it as well. So my go-to strategy and my recommendation is to really find ways to demonstrate impact, and the money, I've seen it usually follow.
That makes sense. All right, so question here is asking, so I agree accessibility is easiest when integrated from the beginning, as you mentioned, but what would be your advice on how to start making an existing site accessible? So it's a site that already exists versus starting from scratch. So any advice on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think approaching accessibility just like any other facet of product development is the right way to think about it. Let's think about a product that you have and you want to identify bugs or barriers in it. What would you do? You would just, sit with your product, conduct usability test, or see what are the top complaints that your customers come back with, feature requests that your customers come back with, and then try and categorize it, prioritize it, and work on it. So the same framework applies for accessibility as well. If it's an existing website, make sure you tap into your panel of customers that has a disability representation to test and give feedback on your website. And that's going to tell you the top blockers, the top things that needs to be fixed in your website. So start with those and get those fixed. Make sure it unblocks users who are stuck on a workflow, who are not able to complete a workflow. That is really the framework that works. And I don't think it's any different than how you would solve for other kinds of bugs in your website or your product.
Yeah. Thank you. All right, so another question I have is, would validating the WIKIG, which stands for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines standards, be good enough to cover all the accessibility issues?
It is a great start. I've seen a lot of companies not even get there. It's hard to get even there. So that is definitely a good start. But I think the North Star should really be, can a person with a disability interact with your product or your service just happily, effectively, as someone without a disability would? So relying on standards and relying on few checklists can only take you to a certain extent. So it really needs to be, your North Star should be to enable any person with disability to interact with your website just like anyone else would do. Yeah.
All right, thank you. All right, so the last question I have here is how best to get quotes from users with disabilities. We don't often know when a user has a disability, but quotes would be very helpful.
So the way that I've seen here, which goes back to several questions that I answered as well, is to partner with your UXR here or your data scientist here to go find the right way to engage with customers who are disabled, people who are users of your product. As I said, it doesn't have to be, if there are privacy laws or legal laws that's preventing you from reaching those customers, you can figure out scenarios where people with temporary or situational disabilities are using your product. Go talk to them. It's just like talking with your customers for any user research. And those people will be able to give you quotes. It's more about asking the right questions to really, let's say that there is an accessibility feature you want to get quotes about. Talking to those customers about how they are utilizing it and probing more into those use cases that align with disabilities is going to get you those.
Right. Thank you. All right. Another question just came in now. What has been your most challenging roadblock with establishing genuine interest and buy-in from management, such as budget we talked about earlier, resources, schedule, and commitments?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and I've seen a change over time. If you were to ask me a year before, I would have said that the challenge for my team was to just even get people talking about accessibility. And now I've come a long way where there is leadership buy-in. My team has wonderful set of people working on accessibility. The blockers now are a little different. I come from a design background. So my blockers now is to see, how do I get engineering leadership on board? How do I get product management on board? And it's important to acknowledge and understand that each discipline or each org operates with their own priorities. And accessibility is not going to be the topmost on everyone's list. So it's just slowly working your way to align incentives and priorities to make your way through. Has been a constant work in progress. And I'm sure it is one of the things that everyone across different teams working on accessibility is facing. There's no shortcut to it. You'll just have to slowly work your way through by demonstrating impact.
Yep, makes sense. All right, so another question related to the champion. So we talked about earlier identifying the champion. So the question says, my org's champion program is struggling to expand the group past a group of interested folks. Mm-hmm. So it's difficult to continue the momentum. So do you have any suggestions on how to keep that momentum and even expand it?
I'll have to know more about this org to really give a targeted answer, but I'm going to just throw out some possible reasons why it might be struggling and ways to improve it. The first thing to really see is to see if these people have a path to grow as champions. A group of people come in, they do something, but then what is in it for them? So there needs to be some kind of a path of growth, even for these AX champions, to keep doing this further. So that's the first thing. The second thing that I can think of is if there's already a group of champions who've been doing work to make things accessible, my question will be to see how to elevate this to leadership. Make sure you have an open space. If you have a workplace group, that's how we do it within Meta. Or if you have a Slack channel, make sure to give constant updates. Make sure to find metrics that you're moving and move it past your leadership to ask for formal support. And I've seen that grassroots efforts never go away, and it's very crucial. But at some point, you'll have to bring in leadership to move that to a more concrete effort that can be everlasting. So those are top things that come to my mind.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much, Ramya. So that's the end of our questions, and that concludes our session. So thank you so much, Ramya, for a great session. And thank you, everyone, for attending. Also, just a friendly reminder that the recording will be available, so you can come back to the same site and watch the recording at any time. And I hope you enjoy the rest of AXCON. There are a lot of sessions tomorrow and the day after. So enjoy the rest of your day, evening, wherever you are, and hope to see you guys tomorrow. So take care, and thank you so much.
Thank you.